Capitalism, more than any other system of structuring a state or structuring an economy, has lifted millions of people out of poverty, has fostered the development of democratic institutions, of the rule of law, of advancing equality of opportunity, and of meaningful participation in a state. But we are willing to acknowledge, and we're happy to acknowledge, that it's not perfect. Occasionally it fails, and occasionally it needs to be fixed. But it doesn't need to be overthrown, and it doesn't need to be destroyed. So what is the principle that we're going to stand by in this debate? Firstly, capitalism, a system which allocates individual control of profit. A market that is the best mechanism to dictate how and where scarce resources are distributed to. Not an absolute or unconstrained market or unconstrained mechanism of allocating capital. What do we support? Things like equality of opportunity. Things like education, inheritance taxes, healthcare, and progressive taxation. Because all of those things are inherently in keeping with maximizing the number of individual actors who can best participate in a competitive setting. Regulation to correct market failures. Things that correct externalities, like putting an appropriate social value on education. Like stopping the creation of monopolies that crowd out the ability of other corporations and other companies and even other individuals to meaningfully compete and actualize their own liberty. Things like the corruption of politics. We're happy to stand by things like media diversity laws, like reforming campaign finance. We think money is speech, but there is a limit to which your speech is allowed to crowd out other persons. So those are things we support. Let's be clear. You don't defend Stalin. We don't defend Gordon Gekko, although Gordon Gekko didn't kill millions of people, so we're probably pretty square on that anyway. So, why support capitalism? Why support markets? The first reason is that people aren't nice, and it would be churlish of me to suggest that you only need to look at a lot of your friends to know that they are inherently not nice people. But while capitalism may accentuate your desires to be selfish, or may accentuate your desire to consume and to deprive other people of resources that you would like, it does not create those desires. And it's ridiculous to suggest that that is indeed the case, because you only have to look at systems which have rejected capitalism, which have rejected any kind of market mechanism, to see that people are still selfish, that people are still greedy, that people will still choose to deprive their neighbours and deprive their friends or anyone that stands in their way of resources. People are inherently selfish. That is something we can't get around. It's something the opposition can't get around. So we think in that context, it's good to have a system that values that, and it's good to have a system that doesn't condemn people for that, to suggest that you're not a bad person for wanting to provide for yourself and for your family. We think that you have to have a system that does reward people for working, that creates incentives for them to work, for them to get out and be involved in society. But that system must be flexible. So the second reason why you should support capitalism is liberty. Because capitalism allows choice. It is fundamentally about the notion that an individual is prima facie the best person able to determine what value is to them, what value is to other people to an extent. To decide that if they want to labour in a given way, if they want to buy a product, if they want to do a certain kind of thing, they should be allowed to do that, provided obviously their choice isn't like going out and killing someone, because that's bad and interferes with that person's liberty. We think that the state is absolutely never able to match that. The idea that the state could, even in a democratic socialist state, even in the best kind of state where individual freedom is maximized, a centralized system of allocating capital, of allocating resources, is never going to be able to match a market, because a state can't react fast enough. A state can't react in a way that facilitates the best allocation of those resources. We think it's a question of a trade-off between individual liberty to work, to sell, to buy, and a trade-off between individual responsibilities to a state that facilitates your ability to do that. But we think capitalism does that flexibly. Regulated and reformed capitalism does that in the best sense, because it's the most nuanced conception of how a state should act. A socialist conception does that absolutely. Finally, the third reason you should support capitalism and support markets: efficiency and productivity. Because when you have a multiplicity of actors competing to sell you something, competing to buy something from you, that does many new things. It means you develop new things, new technologies, new products, new things that you didn't know that you could have, new things that you didn't know could make your life better. But you also make those things much more efficiently. What does that do? It produces surplus. It means you can have more things made. Why is that good? 3 reasons. The first is the necessary human happiness that comes to someone from owning things, right? Like, I see a lot of you are using iPhones. Those are pretty great, right? You can't have those in a system that doesn't reward innovation and continual development of goods. Secondly, you can reinvest that profit, you can reinvest that surplus for growth, to expand your business, to enable more people to have a job, to work, to be happier. Thirdly, and importantly, Madeline's going to bring you more analysis on that, you can tax that wealth. You can tax it to support all the kinds of equal opportunity programs, all the kinds of social crucial goals that both a reformed capitalist system and a socialist system agree are important things. So why does capitalism necessitate that equality of opportunity? Because a market ideology necessarily requires like a range of competing actors and requires individuals who hold capital, who hold wealth, to allocate it effectively. And if not, the market will deprive you of that capital. If you are not an effective actor, you will lose out. Other people will rise up, other people will become a more effective actor in that context. Because capitalism benefits people, benefits itself when it is equal. Because if you give people an education, if you give them a good standard of healthcare, you then have more people who are meaningfully able to compete, and you have more people who are meaningfully able to participate in the society that you would like to see. That's things that justify something like on a reformed capitalist stance, like an education system, like a public education system, like an inheritance tax, because those things go a long way to ensuring as many people are capable of meaningfully contributing and meaningfully benefiting from a system. We also think that the market spreads wealth generally. We think that things like millionaires buying yachts is firstly rare, but secondly, ultimately self-defeating. When you have wealth, buying like a luxury asset, even if it didn't provide jobs for people that made those assets and demonstrate that wealth back into the community there, buying that asset's not a smart choice. You're much better off holding your wealth or investing it. So even things like saving your wealth and doing nothing with it in a bank allows a bank to lend that wealth, allows a bank to facilitate the growth of a smaller business. So in all those contexts, it means that money is always spread. It means that money is always channeled into ways that allow people to actualize their own conception of what's important in their life. Because we were happy to stand by a system that has traded off the importance of allocating resources effectively, but also one that prioritizes liberty and equality. We are very happy to propose.
Nice to finally put some faces to the names of Facebook trolls. Good to see you all. I want to start with a few disclaimers. The first disclaimer is that I want to just reference a few of the things that the first affirmative speaker said. He spent a good few minutes pontificating about what great champions for reform the affirmative team is. But I think that's quite ironic, given that today in Australia, it's actually Socialist, and in particular, Socialist Alternative, that is at the forefront of all the key major campaigns for progressive reforms, from same-sex marriage rights to refugee rights to the union movement in Australia. Our members and Socialists in general clearly are not in the business of waiting for the revolution. We throw ourselves headfirst into all campaigns for progressive reforms. But at the same time, we're also not naive enough to think that it's enough simply to reform capitalism. We understand that capitalism will always reproduce and repackage oppression and injustice. And that's going to be really the main theme running through our debate today. The second disclaimer, which I thought was going to be fine because the first speaker for the affirmative said social alternative, they're not for Stalin. It's true we're not for Stalinism, but it's also true that he then went on to make a false counterposition between the market and the state. We want to be clear that whether it's market-run or whether it's state-driven, capitalism is capitalism. It doesn't do the teachers much good today in Victoria for the fact that they're employed by Ted Baillieu. He's still giving them an insult of a pay rise, isn't he? There's going to be the largest teacher strike tomorrow in Victorian history if people want to come along. The point is, capitalism is a system run by a tiny minority of people in the interest of profit-making. Whether that's done by the state, like it's being done today in Cuba or Vietnam, or like it was done in the Soviet Union, or whether it's done by the market and by major corporations and private capitalists, for us, that's immaterial. The main thing is, it's run by a tiny minority of people in the interests of profit-making. But, onto my first substantive point. I want to ask what is quite a simple question. It's a question we don't really ask ourselves enough. And that is, well, why would we just want to simply reform capitalism? I think if you look at the way that the world is today, if you look at the way that the world works, surely our imaginations aren't so blunted that we can't think of something entirely better. Now, I know there's the whole thing about, the respectable law student circles, we can't be too radical. Is that question nuanced enough? I'm not sure if it's complex enough. I really do think that's a question that we do not ask enough. I want to paint a picture for you. Today, in this world, in 2012, 9 million people are going to die of starvation. That's 9 million this year, 9 million last year, 9 million next year, and so on, so forth. That's the world. It's also a world where North America alone, one continent alone, produces enough food for the entire world to eat 1.5 times over. So you've got people dying of starvation, but one continent producing enough food for the entire world to eat 150%. Another example, the United Nations estimates it would only take $40 billion per year to provide every single human being with food, clothing, basic sanitation, clean water, and working electricity. But of course that doesn't happen. Instead, governments around the world choose to spend $1.15 trillion on the military and on weaponry every single year. Another example, climate change. Every single serious scientist, aka not Andrew Bolt, is clear that we need to reduce carbon emissions by 80% by 2050 if we are to avoid serious and irreversible climate change. Otherwise, we're going to reach that tipping point of no return. And yet, nothing is happening on climate change. In the last decade, in the OECD, emissions went up. Why? $13 trillion worth of investment capital is tied up in fossil fuels. Now, I'm no doctor, it's true, but I think that if you look at those problems, actually the solutions aren't that complicated. So you've got hungry people, right, and you've got enough food produced by the world. Well, again, maybe I'm missing something here, but what I would do is I would take the food and give it to the hungry people. You've got an environmental catastrophe threatening to wipe the entire human race off the planet that is directly tied to our use of fossil fuels. I don't know, I feel like I'm eating crazy pills, but for me, the solution would be reduce the use of fossil fuels and invest in renewable energy technology. The point is that none of these problems are mere aberrations. In fact, they're systemic. They stem from the social structure of capitalism. They're not mistakes, they are symptoms of a system that is built around profit. And that's going to be our key definition of capitalism. It's a symptom where, due to the fact that ownership and control of the entire economy is concentrated into the hands of a very small number of people, everything is produced in society, not to satisfy some human need, but rather to make a profit and to be sold on the market. The other side, of course, of the definition that the affirmative team missed out on is the fact that under capitalism, as Marx very astutely wrote in the Communist Manifesto, there are two main classes. There's the class that owns the means of production, that runs the economy, a tiny minority of people like Gina Reinhardt and Rupert Murdoch, we all know them, they're very famous. And then there's the rest of us, the vast, vast majority of society who do not own capital, who do not own a factory, who do not own a hospital, who don't own any section of the economy. And so in order to stay alive, we must work on the means of production simply in order to live. If you want to see a really good example of this, just head into the city to the CFMEU picket line and look at Daniel Grollo, one of the richest people in Victoria, pockets millions and millions of dollars every single year without actually producing any of that wealth, and then look at the hundreds and hundreds of workers whose lives he is endangering by skimping on safety mechanisms on the work site. There's a strike going on. If people support workers' rights, they should head in there. Now, for us, as I said, reforms are very important. We fight for reforms every single day, but they do not alter the fundamental social structure of capitalism. They don't change the fact that wealth and power is concentrated into the hands of a tiny number of people like Gina Reinhardt. So I think, again, we come back to that central question. Why wouldn't you want to just abolish the whole system? Why do we want to just tinker here and there with little bits of reforms? For us, there's been years and years and years, centuries even, since capitalism started, of reforms. And still, the situation that I outlined at the start of this speech remains the same. More people live in poverty than any time ever before. I want to end quickly, though, with a brief example from Greece. I think it's a really good human example of the way that capitalism destroys lives. Greece, as we know, the ordinary people of Greece, the poor people of Greece, the working class of Greece, have been forced to pay for an economic crisis that they played no role in creating. This is a crisis caused by the capitalist class around the world. And yet, the European capitalist class and the IMF are forcing, through austerity, Greek workers and ordinary Greek people to pay for the crisis. Well, in April this year, a Greek man who'd spent 6 decades in the workforce, 6 decades working very hard to put food on the table for his family, he walked into the central square in Athens and he shot himself in the head. And his suicide note said this. He says, "I see no other solution than a decent ending before I start looking in the garbage to feed myself." Now, this isn't in Africa, this is in Greece, which is a first world country. I think we have to be clear, this is capitalism. And I think we, as a human race, can do much, much better than a barbaric system like this. Thanks.
ladies and gentlemen, you don't have to be a socialist to care about starving people. You don't have to be a socialist to campaign for equal marriage rights. You don't have to be a socialist to have a conscience. But the reality is that distributing the means of production to workers doesn't create any new incentive for those workers to care about starving people in Africa. The barrier to that happening and the barrier to all of the changes that Declan spoke about is not the system that's set up in it, but the views of the people who happen to be the richest. And distributing it more perfectly within Australia doesn't mean that those blue-collar workers are more likely to distribute that money to people halfway around the world or to do a better job of fighting climate change. So what I'm going to talk about in my speech is why capitalism actually creates far greater capital for creating real social reforms. But let's deal with a bit of rebuttal first. And the core of Declan's speech was essentially that to really care about these issues, and big issues we recognise they are, you have to be socialist. To really know how to fix them, you have to be socialist. Let's break that down. Firstly, if it's so simple to take food that is being wasted in a country where it is unnecessary and therefore unwanted and therefore not creating money, and take that to somewhere where people want it, there is probably money to be made in doing that. It may not be very much money to be made in doing it, but there's probably a capitalist incentive to do that already. So the real question is, why isn't that happening? And a lot of it has far more to do with geography and far more to do with the fact that transporting wheat long distances is incredibly expensive and very difficult to do, even when you have a monetary incentive to do it, and the fact that food wastage and spoilage happens just as much on a ship as it does in a warehouse in the US. But those barriers aren't barriers that are changed by who controls the means of production or by how much you happen to care about that issue. Those are barriers that only can be changed by centralised reform that mandates those things happening and sets aside capital where there is no real incentive for any particular individual to set aside that capital of their own right and of their own volition. Which means that they're actually equally reliant on governments forcing that to happen. Don't let them tell you that because we create a socialist utopia, everyone automatically hands over their money. It requires a level of regulation and a level of force. And that might be gentle force, it might be gentle coercion, but the reality is you're still dependent on there being an incentive for those policies to be passed and for those policies to be followed. So there's no reason why you couldn't pass those same policies in a capitalist system, enforce them in the same way, and send food to Africa. There's no reason why you can't take those steps. And as I'm going to show you in my speech, those steps are more likely to be effective in a capitalist system. Okay. Let's move on then to my positive material, and let's talk about how we get real support and real feasibility for social equality and real support for those policies. Firstly, pragmatically. Declan stood up in his speech and said socialist alternative is at the forefront of the same-sex marriage debate. I want to ask you, how many of you support gay marriage and have angrily walked past socialist alternative people trying to get you to sign a petition? The association of those policies and of those social reforms with revolution and with a desire to overthrow an entire system stops people from identifying with those reforms. It stops people standing up and saying, I'm willing to stand for those same things. It stops people, in particular, being active in their support, where they happen to hold those views, be comfortable with those views, genuinely believe that changes need to be made, but be entirely uninterested in overthrowing capitalism and throwing out their iPhones. And it's perfectly reasonable for people to feel that way. And so the question is, if we want to get those reforms, are we substantially better off directing our attention to getting those reforms rather than overthrowing a system in a way that we've seen absolutely no evidence would actually lead to those reforms following inherently? But secondly, let's talk about why capitalism provides more capital to do that. Real equality and real genuine equality, and we're not even talking about the fancy stuff, we're talking about an equal right to be fed, is really expensive. And it's not just the cost of feeding people, it's the cost of making that sustainable. Systematically shipping wheat to Africa is not a sustainable system. The cost of genuinely bringing those people out of poverty is massive. Sending billions of dollars of aid hasn't done it. Chances are it's going to cost a lot more. And so the question is, when those things are already hard to get people to put aside their own benefits and their own concerns in order to invest in, you need a system that incentivises efficiency and incentivises wealth and resource creation so that you have those resources to fix those problems. And it's not just true of problems like poverty, it's equally true of problems like climate change that are expensive to deal with, that require systematic reforms to infrastructure that cost large amounts of money. The benefit of a capitalist system is efficiency. The core of that system is efficiency. The core of that system is wealth and resource generation that allows you to combat those types of problems and allows you to genuinely set aside the money that you need to make those changes. But there's another reason why capitalism is substantially better suited to doing it. And it comes down to the nature of the approach that capitalism and socialism take to the individual and to an individual's expression and an individual's rights. Capitalism is inherently individualistic. It says, you have a right to express yourself, and we will create the opportunities for you to do that and the opportunities for you to be the person you want to be and the person you're capable of being. Socialism says everyone needs to have an equal access to this set of things, and it has to say that. It has to say that because it's about protecting equal standards. It's not about protecting equal opportunities. And the problem with that, the depth of the problem with that, is about that individualistic nature of capitalism. It's about the fact that not everyone does prioritise the same things. Some people are very willing to forego things like food and shelter in order for them to be able to fulfil particularly expensive religious requirements. And those people who want to prioritise those things are best able to do that in a system that gives them equal opportunities and then says, now you use those in the way that best incentivises you. Centralised state control doesn't do that in anywhere near the same way. I want to finish by saying this. Just as the majority of society is neither Gina Reinhardt nor Fidel Castro, there is a massive spectrum in terms of politics, levels and levels of degrees between absolute capitalism and absolute socialism. And the solution to problems that you identify in capitalism is not to throw that system out the window, unless you've proven that you've found a better system. Swapping to another system, swapping entirely to another system instead of reforming the one you have, requires you to show that your system works, rather than just to point to problems in the status quo. The fact that there are problems with capitalism is simply a reflection of the fact that there are problems with human nature. That doesn't mean any other system is better for it, and it does mean you need to do a hell of a lot more to prove that your system would work. We're proud to oppose.
All right, so I think this is a really important question, and being an important question, it probably has some relevance to the world that we live in. Not that you'd know that by the affirmative side. All these abstractions, efficiency, effectiveness, these kind of euphemisms for the profit motive, the only material kind of way of tackling the question that we saw the last speaker use was one of geography. We can't feed starving people because of geography in the 21st century. Here's an example. In 2005, when food riots were going on throughout Latin America and around the world, throughout Africa, 1 kilometre off Haiti, food was dumped astronomically. This is while most of the population was eating mud cakes. They couldn't move that food 1k. Well, it actually comes back to what the affirmative side have been talking about. Capitalism is about correcting market failures, about profit. You have to profit. People do have to starve, even though you could very easily ship more than enough food over there, even though you could very easily redirect finances. They have to starve because it's good for profit. This has to happen, just as people have to be homeless. If you want to talk about geography, in Australia and in America, I think it's about 22 empty houses for every homeless person. This is the system we live in. But I think, speaking of talking about the real world, to begin with, the position of the affirmative side, what basis does it have in the real world at the moment? We are living in a period of immense counter-reform. Look around. We have a reform government in Australia. What has it done? What are the Democrats doing in America? Or look at somewhere where the economic crisis has hit. The PASOK government, the centre-left, reformist, social democrats who have held power for most of the last 40 years, when the crisis hit, the only things they introduced were malaria, tuberculosis and Nile fever. What they ushered in was a 1,200% increase in AIDS in a couple of months alone, because they liquidated 30% of the population's jobs. They slashed healthcare, they slashed welfare, public housing, public education, everything that the affirmative side has lauded. And this was, of course, after bailing out the banks and the super rich who caused the crisis in the first place. However, we're living in a horrifying period at the moment, but it is true that in the past, battles for social justice have been won without completely destroying the structural framework of capitalism. Reforms have won through. But, like, how successful have these reforms been? Like, a reform is supposedly, it's there to kind of improve the conditions of oppression of the working class under capitalism. It's there to fight against forms of oppression. But, like, let's take a couple of major examples. Take, for instance, the civil rights movement in America. This abolished Jim Crow. It abolished institutionalized segregation in the South. And 40 years later, well, blacks are just as oppressed in America as they ever were. You can look at figures for imprisonment, for unemployment, victims of police violence. Look at the case of Trayvon Martin just this year. A teenage African-American boy eating Skittles on the sidewalk was gunned down by a white vigilante. That vigilante was let out of prison that night with no charges because by Florida's stand your ground law, he had every right to do what he did. I think all we have to do is imagine if identities were reversed, if it had been a fully grown black man killing a white teenager eating Skittles, well, I don't think the outcome would have been the same. You can look at apartheid in South Africa. What has overthrowing apartheid meant when just 2 weeks ago we saw 30 black miners killed by white police, and again, no charges were laid against the police, charges were only laid against the co-workers of the miners. And how did that happen? The ANC, the body that overthrew apartheid, brought back an apartheid law to charge those workers with murder. And you can look at the introduction of the Northern Territory Intervention in Australia. They tore up the Racial Discrimination Act. This was just 5 years ago, and they've continued it just a couple of months ago. So I think what we then confront is, well, how can you have actual, permanent, lasting change? Is it even possible, or are we just overruled by the human nature that the affirmative side has brought up? Well, I think if we contrast the two major changes, the two most publicised changes at least, of recent history of the last 5 years, on one hand you have the election of Barack Obama as president of the USA, and on the other hand you have the Egyptian revolution, which took place at the beginning of last year. Now, Obama should surely be the poster boy for reformism, right? I mean, he was elected on the back of an 8-year, almost unconscionably right-wing Republican government. This is a government that slashed welfare, healthcare, public schooling, public housing. This is a government that was constantly racist and sexist and homophobic, that blatantly ruled for corporations, and that started wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which to date have killed almost 1.5 million people. Like, that should be enough to shake your faith in the system as it is, right? But if you were a die-hard parliamentarian, you could always say, well, it's not the system, it's the fact that this fucking illiterate cowboy is in charge. George W. Bush. That's the problem right now. And, like, fair enough, he was an incredibly stupid man. But, well, in complete contradistinction to that, you have Barack Obama, incredibly well-educated, very articulate, very charismatic. And what have we seen? He rose with the centre-left, the Democrats. He rose on the basis of hope and change. Those were his big slogans. 4 years later, he's continued the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's exacerbated those wars. Drone strikes over Pakistan, dropping depleted uranium over Libya. The Times magazine on their cover a couple of months ago showed that he had his own personal hit list. Anyone on that list who was killed, and anyone who was got in the crossfires while someone on that list was killed, they could be termed an insurgent as long as they were Muslim. On the other hand, we have the Egyptian revolution. Millions of people rise up in Egypt. Millions occupy Tahrir Square, mass strikes, and in contrast with 4 years of Obama attacking ordinary people, in 2 weeks, the Egyptian people overthrew one of the most brutal dictators of the last century. What was the crucible of this revolution? It wasn't, some enlightened leader, it wasn't statesmen, it was factory workers, largely textile factory workers, people who spend their lives slaving away for $2 a day, but who had the power, merely by putting their hands in their pockets, to bring the system to its knees. A few thousand people drop their tools and the world shakes. And it's through the strike going on that's costing Daniel Grollo $500,000 a day, that we see how the system works, that we see how it can be crushed, that it is centred around exploitation, and it is from exploitation that all the atrocities that Declan enumerated emerge. As Martin Luther King said, the problem of racism, the problem of exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. They are the triple evils that are interrelated. They cannot be done away with through an integral series of reforms. They cannot be isolated from the system and lopped off. They can only be gotten rid of when capitalism itself is consigned to the dustbin of history. Cheers.
ladies and gentlemen, I am very sympathetic to the intuition that tells you that a world that is in crisis, a world full of homophobia and racism and sexism and poverty, needs a radical solution. I get that in a world in which the financial crisis has occurred and that has hurt some of the poorest people on earth hardest, there needs to be a radical solution. But remember, there are two radical solutions on offer to you in this debate. One is to end crony capitalism and unbridled financial deregulation that led to some of these crises, but defended the benefits of a world in which people were still rewarded for the work that they did and still allowed the liberty to choose which things that they wanted to value more than other things. And a radical solution, on the other hand, that wanted to get rid of that entire system. But we heard very little about what would replace that system, very little detail about how that system could generate the types of wealth that would allow the types of socialist projects that we all think are important. So just remember, despite that intuition that there's a lot wrong with the world, what we do with that intuition and the two responses available to us are the context of this debate. And I'm going to tell you why the affirmative side's radical solution is to be preferred. So 2 questions to frame this speech. Firstly, are the problems of our society at the moment intrinsic to capitalism? And secondly, will a world without capitalism, presumably one with socialism, be preferable to a reformed capitalism model that we proposed? So, to this first question, the principled case from the first negative speaker was that the ownership and control of money is centralized in a system, and that is what leads to capitalism's evils. We supported breaking down that centralism. We said that a market ideology is only rational if people have an equal capacity to be able to engage in that market. It's silly to say that a market allocates wealth effectively or efficiently if only one set of people or only one set of genes has access to that money to deploy it. We supported policies like progressive taxation and inheritance tax, like a beefing up of funding for public education in a way that made private schools a worthless investment by parents. All of those types of policies would allow that type of property, non-property class distinction to break down. The question is, do we want a system that still allows people to own property? Do we want them to be able to own property proportionate to the amount of work they do? Do we want a system that allows people who work hard to be rewarded for that work? We obviously don't support a system in which people who do no work are rewarded absolutely, and people do the hardest work get no money. That's not the system we proposed. We proposed a system that broke down those inefficiencies, that broke down those market failures, but kept the underpinning logic that says that when people work harder, they deserve more rewards, and that trade-off is exactly the way that we should construct our society. The specific examples of problems and the manifestation of this underlying premise that power and money is concentrated were twofold: the environmental consequences and the food distribution problem. And no doubt that there are many, many other problems associated with that, and we're happy to say that a lot of them could easily be reformed in the same way. But let's deal with the primary ones that were brought out by our opposition. On pollution and carbon pollution reduction, we can correct that externality. We stood for correcting the externality that comes when the profit motive leads to harms to the environment. We think that's an externality that should be priced in, that the people who profit from that type of production should have to pay the costs that are felt by other people associated with that production. That was a principle we stood for. The question is, should we try and find the least cost way of protecting the environment without costing the millions of people, of the poorest people on earth, their jobs that work in that industry that also pollutes? Because while there's no doubt that the people who make the most money from carbon pollution are the richest in society, and they deserve to be taxed higher and we support that, the reality is that lots of people work in industry who need those jobs, who need that capacity to access that wealth themselves so that one day they can own property and one day they're going to be able to improve the lives of their children. We think that principle means that a capitalist system that prices pollution and corrects for externalities is the best way to find the least cost way of doing that while ensuring the most number of people can retain their jobs and have jobs in the future. The fact that North America is able to produce enough food for 1.5 times the world's population is 2 things. It is the terrible shame that exists in balance with the poverty that exists in Africa now that's been pointed out by opposition. But it's also a marvel that one continent on Earth can produce 1.5 times the amount of food needed for the whole world. So the question is not, should we get rid of the system that produced that amount of food? The question is, how should we distribute that food in a way that makes the most amount of people able to have a full meal? Because we think we should take the system that produces so much food so efficiently with only one small part of the world's land and one small part of the world's resources and use that system to enable us to spread that wealth in a way that benefits as many people as possible. Because it's been the case of the opposition that people have to starve, people have to be homeless for capitalism to profit. That is a human tragedy that both capitalists and socialists can recognise, but a strictly cynical capitalist would also look upon that as a failure of the profit incentive. That's people who would be prepared to buy food, who would be prepared to occupy a house and could contribute more to the market. So while it is a human tragedy, and both sides can recognise that, there is no reason why capitalism would celebrate that. There's no reason why capitalism would want that to occur, because it's disadvantageous for the people within capitalism who operate that system. We haven't heard a reason why capitalism would want to create that, as opposed to just an unregulated form of capitalism having had created that. And that's the distinction between the two teams so far in this debate. To turn quickly to this second question. Will a world without capitalism, presumably one with socialism, be preferable to the reformed model of capitalism advanced by the affirmative side? James, our first speaker, advanced some important material about the advantages of capitalism, insofar as it aids in getting access to liberty and allowing people to price their own preferences and compete with other people and find efficient ways of producing goods that are important to as many people as possible, which generates surplus and allows us to do many other human projects that are important, whether that be reinvesting it to generate even more wealth, whether that be buying things that make you and your children and your family and your community better and happier, or whether or not it be, thirdly, allowing the government to tax that and use that money to be able to provide other services to other people. Those are the advantages that come from surplus, and that was a system that properly regulated would generate a lot of surplus, the capitalist system. The question you have to ask yourself is, are you confident that the same world that has overwhelmingly elected the types of people that have been derided by the opposition in this debate would share and distribute that money more fairly in a socialist system? Because we're prepared to concede that the way that we talk about capitalism accentuates the worst bit of people's selfishness. But the reality is that underpinning that world is a selfish world that has led to the types of consequences and the management of capitalism in the way that's been derided by both teams. So the question we have to ask is, should we use a system that harnesses that selfishness, that hedges against that selfishness, and co-opt that to provide goods for everyone, or should we throw it away in the hope that we can find another system that ignores that selfishness but potentially places us more at risk of the way in which certain selfish people within that dynamic will be able to free ride and exploit the other people who work harder around them? That was the choice you had between two radical solutions, one that was painted clearly and had arguments for it by this side, and another side that just wanted to oppose capitalism as it is. We also oppose capitalism as it is. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think I'll begin with talking about this thing that's been put up by the affirmative, this idea that actually maybe it wouldn't be any better if all the people working out in our world, all the people that wear blue singlets, etc., the world wouldn't be better run by them than it is run by the likes of Daniel Grollo, Gina Reinhart, Barack Obama, Julia Gillard. Firstly, the majority of people in this country, time after time, say that they think more money should be directed towards healthcare and education. Some of the things that the affirmative have pointed to as reforms that, in some theoretical wonderland of capitalism could exist. The majority of people in this country oppose the Iraq War. The majority of people in this country support same-sex marriage. On the other hand, we have the capitalists, people who, I was just watching Capitalism, a Love Story the other night, people who own Walmart. That's one of the richest, they're one of the, Fortune 500 companies or whatever, and they actually take out life insurance policies on their workers so that when they die, they make money, they benefit from their workers dying. Similarly, business, building industry moguls actually factor in the amount of workers that could die whilst building their building. And how does that weigh up against the cost of installing some scaffolding and some basic safety precautions? And generally they factor in that it'll be better off if just a few workers die than having to actually fork out for safety measures or to allow the union on site. So I think it's worth reflecting on what Madeline and the affirmative have said, that they actually don't think that working class people who on every single question are to the left of our government and the capitalists would be better off at running our world. I think that's a pretty sickening and anti-working class, anti-human proposition, actually. All right, now I want to deal with what they've argued in terms of reforming the system. So first up, there's the reforms that the affirmative have actually pointed to, which they think are possible under capitalism, or in fact, I wasn't clear because they didn't point to any concrete examples of these actually existing, whether they think that they do. One was an education system, an expanded education system. Yeah, that is a reform that at times under capitalism we've been able to fight for and win. We had free education in this country for 2 years. So the free education that everyone talks about, the great education reforms, they lasted 2 years. Today, we have a Labor Prime Minister, previously an Education Minister, who came out on the radio today to say, let's get rid of these politics about funding for private and public schools. They all need to be funded equally. This is in a situation where class sizes are bigger than ever, where teachers' pay is lower than ever, and where, TAFE in Victoria has just been savagely attacked. Education standards are going backwards. Access to education is going backwards. 70% of students that come to this university are from private schools. This is a very different picture from the 70s. Look across the world, all across Europe, education, healthcare, every social service you could imagine is being absolutely savagely cut. The reality is that we are living in an era of counter-reform, savage counter-reforms. The things that people talked about in terms of reforming the system back in the 70s are not on the table, not from the Tories anywhere in the world, but not even from the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats, the people that have always been for reformism, are the ones saying we need to cut. The other thing that the affirmative have talked about is market regulation. So where does this exist? Okay, the environment, the carbon tax. That's hardly a punitive measure against big fossil fuel producing companies in Australia. I don't know if anyone's noticed, but they're all pretty happy with the amount of compensation they'll be getting from the government, and pretty happy with carving out a niche market around it. Market regulation, the affirmative have not pointed to a single example where this is actually working to anyone's favour. Corporate and business tax rates are actually lower than ever before. And this is in the context where governments have actually not just maintained low corporate tax rates, but have bailed out big businesses, big banks, big insurance companies to the tune of trillions and trillions of dollars. The people who are being taxed, on the other hand, the people who are being smacked with austerity measures are the working class. This is an era of counter-reforms. Now, there's a reason for this. It's because the theoretical crap about, that's been dreamt up in Harvard universities and, universities like Harvard, but has never actually reflected reality, that capitalism is a system that theoretically could benefit us all if we just regulated it better or if we let the wealth trickle down. Both of those theories have miraculously failed because the heart of capitalism is the profit motive. And the capitalists competing around the profit motive means that they need to eat each other up, means that they need to find ways to exploit their workers further, means that they need to pressure governments to actually change the system so that they can compete as best they can, so that they can drive down living standards, drive down wages. This is what's beneficial to the market. This is what's beneficial to the capitalists. There is no theoretical way that this can be transformed, and it certainly hasn't ever manifested in reality. Okay, well, the last thing I want to deal with is the question of, do socialists put people off reforming things, fighting for reforms? Because contrary to what Madeline said, actually, since Socialist Alternative took up the cause of same-sex marriage 8 years ago, at that point 38% of the population was in favour of same-sex marriage. The majority of people were against it. Today that figure is at 64%.
AOSA.
Thanks, yeah. And we have obviously been a massive part of that campaign. But actually, if you look at history, there's never actually been some distinction between the people that want revolution, want to get rid of the whole system, and the people that fight for reforms. Most reforms have been begun, the fight for them has been begun by a minority of people who actually go out there and fight for something which the status quo, the majority of people are against. Apartheid in South Africa, a tiny minority of people actually in this country and around the world opposed apartheid South Africa, but today you'd find hardly anyone who defended it. There's also the case, look at classic reforms like the civil rights movement, the women's movement. All of these fights were began by a minority of people and then gained momentum amongst a majority of people, amongst the working class mainly. And there's another sort of reason, there's another tie between reforms and people that want to tear down the whole system. If you look at most of the profound struggles in our history, it's actually led people to take conclusions against the whole system. Martin Luther King identified at the end of the 8-year-long campaign for civil rights in America, which is obviously still ongoing, that actually capitalism is the evil. Germaine Greer said, in order to be a feminist, you have to be a socialist, because how can you be for equality between the sexes and not be for equality for all? This is what people are driven to realise in the course of fighting for things, because we do not get anything given to us easily. We have to fight for it, and actually we're fighting against a system that wants to deny us these things. Lastly, I want to say that a more left-wing reason that people think that you can't reform the system, is that my time? A more left-wing reason that people think you can't reform the system, but wasn't actually advocated by the affirmative, surprisingly, is that it's just been around forever, and we can't possibly, this is just the way the system is. But actually, history is not stagnant, and feudalism was around for 600 years. Capitalism's only been around for 200 years. And there were people like the people on the affirmative today who argued that feudalism should never go. People like Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And they got their just desserts. Because history isn't stagnant. Systems change. When there's a problem with a system, people fight to overthrow it. It's why we've seen revolution after revolution over the last 200 years. We will continue to see that. We need to fight for that. We need to fight for a better world, but also every single reform that we can grasp from the hands of the capitalists in the here and now. Thanks.